Hello, and welcome back to Streaming Media Connect 2024 and our last session of the day, X Factor, Cutting Cloud Streaming OpEx. I'm Steve Nathans-Kelly, Editor-in-Chief of Streaming Media, and I want to start by thanking our diamond sponsor, Native Frame, and I'm going to show a little silent film from them right now. Thanks to Native Frame, and I'd also like to thank this session's sponsor, Zixi, and just a few announcements before we get started. Let me bring up my announcements here. I think I know them by now, but yeah. So the first person to name the music you heard as we were coming in, if you stick around till the end, you will. If you name the group and the track, you will win a $50 gift card from Amazon. And please chat in the chat and put your questions in the Q&A. I'd also like to thank this session's sponsor, Zixi. And we will be back here, right here in November 12th to 14th with the next Streaming Media Connect. And in a minute, I will put a link in the chat to the call for speakers, which is open now. And so send us your ideas and see if we can get them into the program. And all of the sessions from this week's event will be appearing on LinkedIn, on YouTube. Several of them are up there already. I'll also put that link in the chat. And yeah, so now I would like to throw it to our host, Jason Thibeault, CEO of the SVTA, the Streaming Video Technology Alliance. Welcome, JT. Good to see you.
Thanks, Steve. Nice to see you as well.
And why don't you take it away?
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much. I'm gonna say that was definitely not a end of the day track, man. I was like, you missed it. I was up river dancing. No, it's very cool. It wasn't the music I was expecting, and I'm not sure what I was expecting, but it was awesome. It was a refreshing change in the music that sometimes gets played. So,
well, that's we're going for it here.
Nice. All right, fantastic. Well, so as Steve said, I'm the CEO. Everyone calls me JT. CEO of the SVTA. If you don't know who we are, we're the International Technical Association for Streaming Video. We focus on solving critical technical challenges of delivering high quality video at scale. So our member companies come together, they build software code, or they draft specifications or documents. We work with lots of other organizations like IETF and CTA Wave. And then we recently just merged with -IF, so they are now part of the SVTA family. And if you're interested, just take a look at the website at svta.org, and all of our stuff that we produce is free, so you can go and download documents and get involved with software projects and whatnot. With that said, we got a really cool panel here today. I'm going to talk about something that is probably near and dear to a lot of people in the industry right now, which is cutting costs. We're going to focus on cloud streaming OpEx and the ways that costs can spiral out of control, and how we might be able to, to rein them in a bit. And we have an absolutely fantastic panel of experts. And so what I'm going to do is give them a little bit of time to introduce themselves, and I'll just call them out one at a time. And so let's start off with Eric Bolten. Welcome, Eric. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
There we go. Hi, JT. How are you? Eric Bolten, Vice President of Business Development, one of strategic accounts for Zixi, and looking forward to talking about all things OpEx.
Oh, I like that. All things OpEx. We could find some things to talk about. How about John Barber?
Hello, everybody. I'm John Barber. I'm a principal architect at Amazon Web Services. I work for the media, entertainment, games, and sports, and have been digging at this cost thing for quite a while. We hear a lot from customers, and be interested to share some of the things we've heard.
Fantastic. And definitely, last but not least, is Abdul Rehman from IMAX.
Thank you, JT. Chief Product Officer at IMAX. We enable premium quality video, as IMAX brand is recognized for in the home through our streaming and consumer technology business unit, and help deliver that at the lowest possible cost. So excited to be here. Look forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. All right. Well, let's kick that conversation off, and let's kind of start at a high level, right? So I think there's probably a lot of categories of costs that people don't understand, or what are some of the things that can get out of control. So if maybe John, maybe you can kick off answering this question first, since you come from a cloud provider. But what are some of those major OpEx costs associated with running streaming in the cloud, and how and which of those can really get out of control?
We'll start with the basic cloud production. We're not talking about acquiring the content and licensing it or any of that kind of stuff. We're just talking about the production side in the cloud. So you have the whole production piece. You may be sending out content that's already pre-produced, which is just a single stream, or you might be running a whole truck or a whole in the cloud production. Those can get very expensive, both on a OpEx and a CapEx. Once you get the live production in or pass through, then you have the video prep to get it ready for the encoding and the streaming, and then you come up with the delivery. So the CDN, the player, the DRM, and the analytics. That's really the third group that we see. So those are really the major chunks that we see. The only thing I'll say is you talked about out of control. The term we use is predictability and unpredictability. When you're looking at cost, one of the things you want to do is you want to draw circles around predictability and unpredictability, and your predictability should stay the same. And then, you're dividing and conquering and trying to manage your unpredictability.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Eric or Abdul, what are your thoughts?
I think constant load workflows where you need to process 24/7, 365. Those are the areas where, relatively speaking, you have higher costs compared to on demand, where you require a whole lot of scale on demand. Relatively speaking, it's on the cheaper side. So just stating the obvious, but since you asked a generic question, I thought
it is a generic question. Yes. Sometimes what people think is obvious is not so obvious. Eric.
So to echo from a Zixi perspective, in the transport world, there's certainly production. We've done some production in the cloud. We showed it at NAB, where we were able to use replay and packaging and actually cut a show. But in terms of overall OpEx costs, you've got your egress, a level of compute, and then you try to manage those elements as elegantly as you can, and you're going to chip away at that. But it's egress and how you architect that. Your commercials will be a direct result of your architecture. So you also need to figure out, as John said, the predictable aspects of the cost, linear versus occasional use, event-based. How does one manage slates? How does one manage switching? How does one manage all the elements? Because when the lights are on, they cost money, and if the lights are off, they do not. So you try to manage that elegance, and then you contrast that with the agility and customizable scenarios that you can run and use cases within the cloud. So I think it's part of an education. I would say that in the initial steps, things tend to be more expensive, and we'll get into the details, but over time you refine that program and you milk out those efficiencies as you go line by line.
And that makes total sense, and that actually leads into the next question. And I'm going to go back to John to start with this one again. And it's John's, because you're sitting at that point where customers are coming to you saying, like, let's build things on top of Amazon. So are there things, and I'm sure Eric and Abdul, you guys are going to have opinions on this, but are there things that streaming operators are doing in their workflows, whether it's on purpose or inadvertently, which is causing some of those, as you termed them, John, unpredictable costs to rise?
Yeah, I mean, I can start with the very tactical people that leave encoders on for the weekend after the Friday night fights. Those are very difficult to engagements to have with a customer. Other things that I've seen is I've seen a customer license content, and the content provider provided a whole ABR stack, and it was a very thick, expensive stack. They had no idea and they were on the hook for the CDN cost. So these are kind of like niche-y things, but I'll get back to what I call the unpredictable. Nobody saw that one coming, especially, if you sign a multi-year contract like that and then try to work it back. The other thing too is, and probably everybody could learn from this, getting the right size content to the right devices, to the right personas. That's a magic trick. There's that tripod there that, you've got content, and you may be doing manifest manipulation or whatever else to, and try and tune down the bits that are going to the cell phones, where you're really not getting that much value off of, sending that much down the pipe, and just kind of massaging that, and there's a lot of tools that are coming out, that are helpful, and that we've got some new stuff that's coming out, with Media Package. It helps out a little bit. And then the last one that I have seen is it's right there of not turning your instances down, is CDN misconfigurations can cause a lot of pain. And because of the way most of them report and bill, you might not know till the end of the month. And that can be a very difficult conversation. So those are the kind of conversations that I had. I don't know if that answers your question, but that was what top of mind.
No, it doesn't. And Abdul,
Yeah.
what are your experiences on that side, sort of seeing things that, or experiencing things that get out of control quickly from a workflow perspective?
I think using instances efficiently to get the best bang for the buck is important. It could be that. So first up, sizing them right, and I think John alluded to that. You don't want to go to an instance size that's bigger than what you need. It could be that a smaller instance would provide you better return on investment for the compute that you want to do. So for example, even if you are doing very computer intensive tasks like encoding, still you want to keep an eye on the workflow that you built, let's say, using an encoder, and the CPU is used like 10%, and you're assuming that I really need the 18x large instance because it's encoding it, and I really need that. Whereas if you look at the spec of the usage, it may be underutilized significantly. So designing that and making sure that your infrastructure, you're utilizing it to the maximum extent and doing some sort of right sizing and fitting it for the workflow, I think goes a long way in making sure that you're optimizing it.
Eric, what are your thoughts?
I would say on the compute side, you've got a couple of factors to consider. One, you try to right size, you try to cluster. So Zixi is a software defined. We focus very much on efficiency and throughput, and different protocols matter. I happen to work for a company that has a protocol, but within the efficiencies we see there, we could be, say, 2.5 times more efficient in the payload than an SRT, for example. That matters on what machines you have to keep. It has, and we will get to the big cost, which will be egress, but you need to find out how you can do more throughput per core. We're getting up to 5 gigs, and you work on technologies like DPDK, where we can get 10x the efficiency. And I could see compute coming down. Now, as John referenced, you get into packaging, transcoding. So GPUs, there is real money. That's an instance that is it needs to be a resource that needs to be looked at very carefully, understand it, and you can get into everything from segment length on HLS, how do you manage the manifests and all those pieces, trying to keep these payloads efficient as possible. But ultimately, the real meter that's going to be running is on the egress charges, and that's going to come down to how you manage the transport layer and how you architect within cloud, hybrid, multi-cloud type options of customers trying to figure out what's the optimal way to deliver the signal.
No, that makes sense. Can you guys hear me? I think my video just went bye-bye.
Yeah,
okay.
It did.
Okay. So good. At least the audio is still working. That's what's important. I'm the man behind the curtain. I think all of those it's really good to talk about these things openly, because I think what people don't realize is that cloud-based either production or streaming, but just anything that's in the cloud and those workflows are composed of so many different little pieces that need to be managed and watched. And again, to John's point about, categorizing them as being predictable or unpredictable, and then understanding the unpredictability and paying attention to like, what size are my instances? Are they right size for this task? Do I even know what size instance would be good for this task, or what's overkill? So it's really complicated. And so this next question kind of tries to get to that is, how are streaming operators managing those costs? Like, are they using tools and platforms? Is it through data analysis and spreadsheets? And maybe Eric, maybe you can start us off on this one, and then we can again just wrap everybody else in.
Happy to. Yeah, no, we see this, and we work with the teams. Like, initially, you set up architectures, you have a legacy set of workflows, and things will be different if you're delivering to, say, MVPDs, virtual MVPDs, all the way to OTT. But I think this line item is part of a larger discussion of total cost of ownership and TCO. And within that, there is the infrastructure cost, the software that's related to it, and all the different other engineering and operational aspects. So I think that initially there is a lot of spreadsheet. We do a lot of work with our clients to help them calculate bandwidth calculators, pieces like that. We're working on a TCO calculator that we're going to release at IBC to help people sort of t-shirt size things as we can get into a deeper dive. But you're going to look at, do you do on-prem? You see a lot of hybrid. Do you use your cloud? You want to trade off the agility and flexibility and scalability that cloud gives you. You want to be able to use metadata and tags to actually have visibility. Our industry has typically, if I had a satellite or a fiber, I know what those costs are and I have a certain capacity. But in the cloud and in OpEx, you really want to get down to a granular atomic level of understanding. And typically success of the broadcast and the signal is the first priority. And then over time, you refine those parts and you start to figure out which line items you can tweak and gain more efficiency through that. And again, you have to balance, is this a sports league that's going OU to a number of people? Is this live linear traffic? Are you slating, not slating? You could change the size of the slate. Are you using any ESNI or ESAM switching? Just all of the elements that come to bear as to when you've turned the on switch or the off switch, or if you need to have an always on switch, how do you minimize what that trickle cost is?
That makes a lot of sense. Abdul, do you have thoughts on that? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of tool use and managing some of these costs?
Yeah, so I think tooling is obviously I certainly a believer of what you can't measure, you can't optimize. So you need to first start by measuring it and understand. Here, I think there are complexities when it comes to workflows. There are multiple components in different types of clients and CDNs from egress perspective, and then within workflows, there are different components that may be needed from automation perspective. So the tools are out there. We do see that there's more and more discipline every step of the way. There's obviously the machine element, but also the human element as well. I've not seen the discipline to the extent that every single cent is accounted for. And I'm not sure if that is really needed as well. It's like the biggest bang for the buck. So you want to look at what are your heavy hitters. And as they say, nothing is too expensive. It really depends on the value it's bringing at the end of the day. So you keep that in mind as well as you look at the data. And we know, as we identified in the beginning, you want to make sure that you understand your egress and encode cost, and others if you have those elements that you're introducing, like AI components. So if you're introducing something that you know by default that is going to be expensive, you want to do the ROI for that beforehand, instead of first putting it in there and then hoping for the best. And now you are stuck in a situation where it's hard for you to take another path because everything is in production.
No, that makes a lot of sense as well. I actually like that phrase you just said. If you can't optimize it, if you can't measure it, I think that's something everyone should have tacked on their wall. John, obviously, since you're in the business of helping these folks do cloud-based streaming workflows, as a cloud operator, does AWS, does Amazon offer tools or ways to help people manage these costs?
We've got some new toolage out that you're running the shows or whatever, or people on a ping or whatever. We've got some things that are out there for like Super Bowls and stuff like that are just really telemetry out that we do. The thing here is you got to work back from the customer and the problem. because there's a lot of customers we have that really are better served by using a platform that runs on us that somebody else manages and everything. And included in there is a lot of optimization, a lot of, information, a lot of data and like that. And they don't have to build all that. And if you're in the business of building this stuff and everything, yeah, it's great to build it and own it. But a lot of our customers, they're better served. So, in answering that question, with the headcount shortage in our industry and everything else, we're seeing a lot of customers move to, some of our streaming platforms. So I'm not sure if that's an answer, but it's an angle that I see on it. That they just don't have the ability to do that along with everything else they have to do. And so we see that as a direction that a lot of people go. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that's built, and like I said, we've got a framework that's pretty interesting. But these things can get expensive to run, especially if they're machine learning based or whatever. I'll just close it with this. I've seen some really interesting stuff done, and they'll run it. They might have 30 channels, and they'll run it and optimize a couple of channels and then take the learnings of that and put it across the other channels, and then they turn it off. And then, a week or a month later, they might fire it up again and look for, okay, how are we doing or whatever. And they do it that way. So that's a trick that I've seen that, if you're going to use something that's going to be pretty expensive, or, it's costing more for us to run the analytics than it is to run the video. But there are uses for that. And there's we've got a fair number of partners that have some pretty interesting solutions for this too.
No, that is interesting. And it's, not to say that going to a vendor and basically giving them the things that you need to give them and taking them off your own shoulder is not a bad strategy. It's one of many strategies, right? So that is a great way to reduce. I guess that's a great way to get costs being more predictable, because you're going to the vendor and you're using the vendor and they're doing everything for you, and you're like, okay, my costs are XYZ. But obviously you lose the flexibility and customization that you may want for some things. So it's always, I think, this balancing act. But in terms of I want to look at three big buckets of cost for cloud OpEx. And that's data, delivery, and compute. And all of those things have components within the streaming workflow. So I want to start out with data. And Eric, maybe you can answer this for us first, but in sort of looking at data, obviously with streaming, a lot of data moving in and out, both in databases and in, on disk. How can those costs be managed better so that they don't just, skyrocket out of control because somebody's not paying attention?
It's an interesting point. So we in Zixi's world are able to harvest really deep telemetry, everything from content quality analytics and packet loss jitter, all the usual suspects. The data itself, it depends on how much one needs to do. I would say that the database aspect is less impactful than the actual payload delivery and the egress cost. And you may overanalyze things until you get to a state where you know what to do. So you've kind of got a dual-fold thing. Why are you doing all these analytics? Typically, root cause analysis, trying to understand what happened in a given scenario. So you may be running a ton of logs and things to try to isolate an issue. But at that point, you start to also, we have alerts for everything, and there's an art form in how one sets thresholds and manage those alert systems to understand what it is that is something that needs to be looked at or something that may be operating within an acceptable parameter. So looking at the data, I think you want to grab as much as you can. And we're even introducing where we're having metadata on live streams that will hop any number of networks and see the topologies that you jump, because when you go from, say, venue all the way through multiple networks to finally get to the point of the consumer, there's a lot of folks in that chain. So you try to optimize the client that's actually bearing the burden of the cost of delivery, but you will overanalyze in the beginning, and then over time you will find out what the optimal steady state, because back to, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But first you need a baseline to work from, and then I think you redact those costs over time.
No, well, I mean, that makes sense. Abdul, what are your thoughts on data?
Yeah. So maybe making a relatively obvious point, in my view, multimedia content from data size perspective knocks it out of the park compared to any other analytics data. And when we are working with video workflows, obviously there's a lot of content involved. And you have multiple workflows often, which means that there's duplicative data and files that are available if you look at file-based workflows. And often those files are have very similar amount of content. We have seen stuff like you have, let's say, archival turned on, you have version control turned on, and now you have 4 TB. It's a premium content, let's say feature film. You have a number of TBs per file, and it's being duplicated and replicated like 20 times. And there may not be any need for that, for example. Or you may have 10 copies of that just because somebody created something else and it's duplicated across multiple groups. So we have seen that firsthand. We have built tools to compare different versions of a feature film, for example, and exactly identify, are they pixel by pixel the same from perceptual quality perspective, or are there additional frames, and where are those additional frames that exist in one piece of content or one version of it versus another one. So at the end, you can delete the ones that you really don't need, and otherwise it's one of those things that you can keep on adding and adding and adding, and it gets out of hand really quickly. So you need to have proper control mechanism in managing the size of video that you're storing. Obviously, metadata and all that, that's important as well, and you need to enrich that to make sure. I mean, there are different approaches that can be used. Needless to say, anything that's more recent, you need highest granularity, and as you go, it gets more old, then you can reduce the granularity and convert that into actionable data, ideally that you can use still to drive your future direction from business perspective or technology decisions perspective, but you can reduce the granularity, and there are various other approaches that can be used as well for that.
Oh, that's really interesting. John, what are your thoughts on this?
You could, I look at data. You've got data around the content, and then you got data around the delivery. Really, are the two big things you're looking at. The data around the content tends to stay around as long as the content stays around, whether it's metadata tagging or whatever. But I think the one that the advice I give customers is, once you get a stable workflow up and like that, and you're generating a lot of data. Maybe you want to put in a sampling mechanism. Maybe you just need to do 1 out of 10. And then with that sampling mechanism, make sure you can flag interesting or unexpected things. And then that's a cost optimization model that I've suggested to customers in the past and seems to work. And typically there's a switch they can turn on and off, whether it's like a high value event, like an Olympics or something that just came by, or they're putting in a new piece in the stack, or they've reconfigured something. They might want to turn it on for a while to get a comfort level in it, and then turn it back down. So you get the benefit of being able to dive deep into the data if you need it, but you can also cost optimize by just going to a sampling strategy.
Interesting. Yeah. So the sampling strategy does make a lot of sense when you start looking at analyzing the data around your data. So one of the next big category, delivery, I think it can be argued that, CDN, whether it's part of something that's integrated with a cloud provider like Amazon or it's separate, is part of cloud OpEx, because it is, a distributed network that somebody else is running, service provider is delivering content on your behalf. So, one of the things I think we can talk about a little bit is, how do we optimize CDN delivery costs? And maybe Abdul, you can start us off with that answer.
Yep. So like I said before, what you can't measure, you can't optimize, in my view.
That's
The
gonna be a
end
tattoo.
customer,
I'm gonna have that tattoo on me next time I see you.
Yeah, that'd be great. I won't be expecting my name under it in case you're planning on doing that. So in this case, when it comes to video content, the final consumer is the human visual system. It's the human on the other side. And in my view, you want to measure from that perspective, and you want to understand what the final experience is going to be, all things considered. And then you want to make sure that you are sending only the necessary amount of bits that are needed for that. That's the fastest way for you to train the data and still achieve the scale. Obviously, there are a number of trade-offs involved when it comes to that. So you have the quality one. So you need to look at a more incremental approach is something that's more common that we have used. So if you're delivering something, some content today and your consumers are happy with that, then you can either adjust that to reduce cost or keep that same quality and reduce cost as well. So I've worked over the past 15, 20 years in measuring human perception and how happy a consumer is going to be when they watch the content, and built approaches that really use the feedback loop to adjust the video size to meet the same quality level while reducing the cost. And you want to do that, obviously, making sure that you're not introducing failure points and you're not introducing latency, and it works with the codecs that you have, so you don't need a major surgery to go to new codecs, and you can optimize your encoding configuration. So all of those options do exist to continue reducing the size, but that is a critical element every step of the way. You want to make sure that you're optimizing to achieve higher scale, higher stability, reliability on the playback side and otherwise, while meeting the customer expectations. And I'm representing IMAX is a big proponent for delivering premium quality at the end. I think in this day and age, when we spend so much time watching video content, and it's becoming synonymous in many cases to various use cases, especially learning about things and entertainment and so on and so forth. I think all streamers out there, I would like to invite them to raise the bar when it comes to quality and deliver premium quality broadly.
I second that. Eric, what are your thoughts on CDN delivery costs? Like how do you manage these better?
Well, we've got a large client, been doing this for years with in the financial news world, who runs 4K. So to Abdul's point, quality being very critical, financial news, that sort of thing. Well, from your quality of service perspective, before you get to the quality of experience, you're going to run a number of signal paths. You're going to have east and west in a given region, and 1 and 2 points in any other global region, especially with global delivery. And it's all about how you're writing to that origin server. So from a Zixi perspective, it's how do I optimize that ABR stack? How do I optimize segment length? What am I trading off on latency versus quality of service? As I extend latency, I can handle different networks. It depends on that robustness. But ultimately, that's going to come down to region by region and whatever contract you sign with the CDN, and you can monitor what that output is from a consumer perspective. But from an egress perspective, you want to look at how you go. And I do work for Zixi, but the Zixi protocol itself, the way that we handle null packets and we can compress, we can save 25, 30% of the overhead that other protocols will put 10% on top in addition to that. And I do see as a larger trend that we're talking very specifically about OTT streaming and CDN, but many of these contribution paths branch out, and some are servicing traditional MVPDs and an IRD at the end as a target, and then others are hitting an origin server that's pulling from that. So you get a bit of a blend, but you will have a transcode within that. You're going to have some ad insertion most likely that has to hit there, and all of those elements are what you're trying to figure out this final network will be processing to deliver it. And there's a whole set of analytic tools that live in the CDN world that we don't know what happens until it hits the device on the other side.
Yep. And that is inherently an issue, right? Which is why I think we're starting to see an uptick in adoption like CMCD, so that can help understand the QoE part of it and relate that back to the costs associated with producing the kinds of content and quality of content that are getting to the devices. Why it's all just really interconnected. John, what are your thoughts on the data? And delivery and controlling some of those costs?
Well, it's kind of like chasing the rainbow. The easiest way is to convince your account manager or whoever your CDN is to lower your rate. but getting that
How often
and I
does that
appreciate the
happen?
sensitivity of everybody in the room. I usually get beat up at this point and was prepared for it. But the reality of it is it's chasing the rainbow. How do you get less bits and get the same job done? And there's a couple of ways, that you can look at it. There's some interesting encoding things you can do. There's some technologies out now that'll read the complexity of a file and build a map and then dynamically adjust the encoder as it's going through the content. There's some strategies like our quality variable bitrate encoding, which will help you out some in that there's no ceiling anymore. If you have a black frame, literally it'll go just about literally to 0 as far as bits used. So there's some encoding, there's some other stuff. It just depends on how far you want to get into it. The big guys, without naming names, are definitely doing content-based encoding. So they're looking at the encoding and building custom encoding strategies for specific pieces of content. Some may vary even within the content. And if you're talking about, things that, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people watch, those things pay back. We were talking about before the session started. Two things I would say about this. One is this is a process and an ongoing process, and it's good to bring in outside people or get fresh eyes on something. Whether you work for your cloud provider, do an architecture review, but get that into the process. And then the second thing that I think that you want to remember is most of the time, if you can shave 2 or 3% off here and there, this is eating an elephant. You're going to take it in small pieces and just look at it holistically that way. That's kind of how I look at the whole CDN and distribution. In large events, CDN sometimes is 90% of the cost of the whole production, sometimes even more. So a little bit of help there is a really big deal. That's where you'll get the most bang for your buck.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, and you had mentioned earlier before about, CDN misconfigurations, right? So there's obviously the need to look at exactly what you're delivering and how you're delivering it, and to whom you're delivering it, to make sure that it aligns with, with what's needed to control some of those costs. The last bucket really is this compute bucket, right? And again, sort of, I'm going to have Abdul, I'm going to have you answer this first, but, John had mentioned this, like, whoops, I left the encoder on for the weekend. Bill shock coming Monday and is really bad. We can't forget about that aspect of it, right? When you start talking about the cloud, it's all of these instances, and you guys had mentioned it before about right-sizing instances for the specific task. So Abdul, how can some of those costs be controlled when the boxes you're using are all the software and everything's virtualized?
I think it starts with determining the per unit cost. I think maybe just to go a little bit deeper into that, like, for example, if you get the biggest instance, and it could be that you can do 4 channels on that, and you look at the cost for doing per channel on that instance, versus if you do another instance which is much smaller and half the price, and you can only do 1 channel on that. Now, you may be thinking that the cheaper instance is the way to go, intuitively speaking, but then you can get higher density on the more expensive one, and would be the biggest bang for the buck. So I think that's you want to be mindful of that. You want to really understand what value a specific element of the workflow is introducing and how to get the best out of that. The other thing that I think you want to do is, when it specifically looks at compute, can you trade off compute when compared to other elements of the equation? So there are overlaps between the data, the compute side, and delivery side. For example, you could do maybe some additional compute, but then save on the delivery side. And you want to model that out. Like, for example, you may be processing Oppenheimer, for example. It's you know that it's going to be washed a lot on the other side. And it could be that you can spend a little bit more on compute, but on the delivery side, you may save tens of thousands of dollars, if not more than that. So you want to look at that in a more holistic fashion when it comes to compute as well. And then that goes back to the discussion that we were having previously on machine learning tasks as well. Is what's the return on investment at the end of the day? What the use cases that you're looking at that? Is it and then you also want to make sure they're you are looking at it, like I said, holistically. So just in that spirit, I've seen out there workflows that are built on spot instances for live workflows in that spirit to optimize compute. So you can really keep digging and try and build those types of workflows and make it more and more efficient. But then your architecture and your workflow needs to be efficient enough. It needs to be capable enough that it can switch in real time without impacting stability of the workflow and so on and so forth. So a number of those techniques are used to keep driving the compute down. But my key advice on this would be to look at it with value in mind that it's generating, and also look at it in a more holistic way. If additional compute can drive down delivery cost, or if the additional compute can drive down the data size. For example, we were talking about sampling earlier, or granularity of data. In order to sample that, you need compute at the end of the day to drive down the size of the data. So again, measure it, look at it holistically, and then make decisions based on that.
Because if you can't measure, can't optimize.
You can't optimize this.
John, what are your thoughts on compute?
I had a couple of them. I wouldn't disagree when I'm here, but I would look at managed services versus building out EC2 instances and running software on them, and the cost and all the OpEx and like that. I mean, if you got 100 engineers in your organization and everything else, and they just like to do that and everything, and that's what they're good at, that's a good choice. But we have managed services, and there's just a lot of headaches that go away with that. Obviously, there's one or two that come in, like if you leave the thing up and running, but you can leave an EC2 instance up and running too. But I would look at optimizing that, because if you have a workflow set up, and let's say you change your profile and you add an additional HD on top, and you're running at 80% on your CPU on your EC2 instance, now all of a sudden you're dropping frames and having problems, and now you gotta go refigure the thing out and say, well, what's the next best instance I want to do? Whereas with a managed service, if you want to add one, if you want to add three, you'll get an incremental cost to it, but you don't have to do any of that, measuring on that. And I don't know if this will come into the conversation, but we did mention GPUs, and we did mention, we have been talking in the industry a lot about ASIC or those types of cards. Definitely seeing a trend getting away from the GPUs. They're just too expensive, and the cloud providers, there's such a demand for those GPU-based systems for the machine learning that's growing, that they're finding it harder and more expensive to get GPU-based solutions. So we're seeing less and less people using GPUs for video workflows, in the cloud. And we have a AMD card-based solution, a VT1 instance, that is a very economical solution too. So that kind of gets between the middle of a managed service and building your own encoder. So the instance comes with your own encoder, and you can control the instance, but you don't have to deal with the encoder. So that's kind of my thought on where we are with compute and some trends and ideas that I've seen.
No, it's really interesting. And Eric, what are your thoughts?
Well, as we've said, I would just say that, compute is important. John's using managed service in a certain context. We tend to think of that as eyes on glass, but we're talking about an actual service layer. I would say, to sort of Abdul's perspective, is it a one-to-one relationship on the signal path to the CPU that you need? CPU, in our experience, might be 10 or 15% of the overall type cost. So it's legit, but it's not the elephant in the room that is egress. The way that you can cluster and manage clusters to load balance and handle that and your failover, those are things that need to be looked at. And you should have a pretty good idea of what your linear capacities would be. It gets a little bit more calculating intensiveness for OU, where you have to know concurrency numbers and what your high water mark will be. And then you look into the elegance of, if I really automate across this, can I instantly, like AWS, Zixi runs on AWS, etc. You're able to spin up and spin down instances very quickly. You'll do typically run event-based things an hour before the show. Then you get into seemingly pedantic but very cost important things like, how do you slate? If you got a 20 megabit program stream and a 5 megabit slate, and you don't want to go below it because it'll do downstream triggers to your partner's alert systems, you have to think of that. If the slate is the same size as the program stream, you're probably paying for a lot of bars and tones that aren't really going around monetizing. But again, it kind of depends on what your taker ecosystem looks like and what your targets look like. But we've been working ruthlessly on throughput efficiency to just make that, we can run on arms. How do you constantly use software to optimize throughput on the compute and then optimize payload so that you manage the egress? I mean, these are the things you can control. And as John and Abdul and I and yourself are talking about, I think we've been the shortness of time. We've got an industry that is compressing down upon itself. Every time we thought the layoffs were over, more come. So they're pressing up against every cost structure they can find. We are hitting it, but ultimately you're going to get down to the long tail. I think initially the curve is fairly high in the learning part, and then as you go over time, you're going to completely line item it down to what its bare bones could be while still hitting the QoS, QoE metrics.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and that is really what we're seeing, right? We're seeing a lot of pressure everywhere within this industry. All right, so we've got 11 minutes left. So I want to turn. We do have some questions from the audience. So I want to make sure that we get to those. Let's start out with the first one, which is Abdul. This seems to be targeted at you. This is: does IMAX optimize content running in AWS? And then what about live content?
We certainly do. I'll just tell a story which is within IMAX. So we recently built a workflow for streaming live content to our theaters. An example was NBA playoffs. We streamed to a number of theaters, and we built that workflow. We got the high quality source feed into an AWS region, and then used AWS technologies, but also our technology to measure human experience, perceived quality, and then optimize number of bits based on that. So we were able to reduce bitrate by more than 50% and still deliver premium quality at these 70, 80-foot screens. And I on LinkedIn, and we put this video out there, and fans were just crazy about these experiences. So we do that is the quick answer.
That's a good quick answer. The second question, let's see. Let's turn this over to John, and then everybody can jump in. But basically, there is a revolt slowly building around the quality. You can't see me because my camera's not working, but I'm putting quality in air quotes aspect of streaming, because you put in quotes. So no Atmos with Amazon Prime as an example. Where do you balance the demand/delivery for competitive top quality against your competition versus OpEx? So I guess quality versus the need to control OpEx costs.
That's a really good question, deserving a much better answer than I'm going to give you. It's a very astute observation. So I've been in this industry a long time, and I remember 5 and 7 years ago doing shootouts for video quality for encoders and on-prem, and then we got to the cloud, and there were other cloud videos, and we were doing shootouts for quality. We don't do hardly any quality shootouts anymore. It's really all coming down to dimes and pennies and tenths of pennies. That's driving it. Now, what I will say is people that are in the content business, I can't mention any names, but people who produce really good content. Well, I can say Amazon Prime. They will go to the tens to get really good quality and like that. When you get into redistribution or rehashing content or user-generated content, it's strictly a nickels and dimes game. So what I'm saying, there's like it's not two distinct games, but two distinct areas at opposite ends. With the user generated content, if they can, do it for tenths of a penny, they do it. And then you come back to the movie studios and, some of our premier customers and Amazon Prime, they are very focused on quality because the quality is associated with their brand. And we hear that. So when you have a brand who is in the content business, they're very sensitive about, maintaining that brand identity in there. And then about 3/4 of the business falls somewhere in between there, where what is good enough? I had a conversation with a customer today, and we talked for 20 minutes on what is good enough. And they had to go back and just soul search. They had to talk to the people that paid the bills, they had to talk to the content producer, talk to the people who represent your customers. So there really isn't an answer, but I hope I gave you some perspectives on customer personas I deal with and how they look at it.
Oh, that is very interesting. Eric, what are your thoughts on that?
So I would just echo what John said, take maybe a step further, but user generated versus very highly branded content. I'm certainly aware of what Prime Video does. They're very careful in everything from architecture to quality of encode, and they have an experience that they need to achieve. And then we see people that do services that run, say, high school sports or things of that nature, let alone the actual UGC. Will just stay in the Amazon family, the Twitch type of stuff, where RTMP, when you have an audience of 14, if you lose a couple, they come back. They're kind of used to that, actually. So that's not surprising. And that is part of the consumer adoption. So the ultimate of that would be Abdul sitting with the IMAX necessity of the world's best quality and how that's going to work. And then you start picking systems and that kind of do that and figure that out. Because where the quality of programming is going, that's probably going to really much drive the ad revenue that sits next to it and how one manages that. And within this whole conversation, I think one of the things that traditionally in our now 101-year-old television industry history, the level of blindness that we would have for years with everything from, I don't know what's sending out and going here, all of this data telemetry and measurement means that while you are ultimately talking about OpEx costs in the context of TCO, this leads to the ROI. So the return I'm going to get is going to be based on what monetization, advertising, or subscription that's required to provide that programming. And as the monetization drops, the good enough will drop. And you're trying to figure out what is the art of the possible, the realm of the possible.
And to double click a little bit on the IMAX front. So, I mean, IMAX exists because it delivers premium differentiated experience, right? That's otherwise nobody would pay more. It's obviously more on the theatrical side, our business, but also on the streaming side. So what we have seen is through the IMAX Enhanced program that we have that is consumer facing, and there are hundreds of titles that are available in IMAX Enhanced as an IMAX Enhanced tier, which is differentiated and premium. The engagement is significantly higher working with our partners and streaming platforms. So you see a significantly higher level of engagement and longer viewing times when the content is available in the IMAX Enhanced format. So there is the audience out there, and obviously, like John and Eric talked about, this type of content, which is premium content, which is obviously watched quite a bit as well. For that content, the quality is a must-have. And obviously looking at viewing environments as well, right? If you put on the headset and you're watching content, it's not like you can do anything else. And if your quality sucks, that's too bad because people are not going to watch it again. So there are certain use cases where quality becomes must-have, and the expectation is pretty high. But there is a relationship between quality and engagement. I think that's $1 million question, JT, that you have asked. And I think there are a lot of studies that are aimed at that, and that still, I think, is unanswered in a definitive fashion.
Yeah, sports is also a very demanding on quality. It goes hand in hand.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, we've got one last question, and this is again for Abdul. It's another IMAX question for you. But what's the difference between CAE and per title, obviously encoding, and what is IMAX doing with perceptual measurement and optimization?
So, so quite a bit of many terminologies there, and I think simply understanding them is the challenging bit. So I think John was alluding to that, like content-aware encoding previously. The content-aware encoding, simply put, you look at the complexity of the content, you measure that, which is relative to that encoder and codec, and see how many bits you really need to achieve reasonable quality. That's what content-aware encoding approaches do. But title optimization approaches work on top of that to determine your ideal adaptive bitrate ladder. So if you need a specific 5-rung ladder for specific content, 3 would work. You maybe can work with that. Or for you can pick the ideal resolution or whatever it may be. So that is an additive technology on top of that. Both of these technologies, they are not primarily driven, as per my understanding, based on perceptual quality measurement. That's based on complexity of content. So you can add an additional element to that, which is to measure perceptual quality, which is what we have done for multiple decades now, and then deliver using content-aware encoding, using perceptual per title optimization, just the enough number of bits that you require to achieve that same quality. So it's an additive thing that delivers 20, 30, even sometime more percentage of savings. And that comes back to a point that we were making earlier. You need to keep adding all of these techniques on top of what you're doing already to continue chipping at reducing cost every step of the way, so you can achieve higher scale, achieve higher stability and reliability across millions of consumers that are out there.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, so we only got to about half of the questions we had on the list, but it's actually not surprising because this topic, I mean, you could just spend hours digging into better and different ways to optimize the cost. But listen, I want to say thanks to our panelists, Eric, John, and Abdul. You guys were great. It's really informative in terms of starting to sort of scratch the surface of, how we can optimize these OpEx costs in the cloud. But again, thank you so much. And I wanted to say thank you for all of our audience for attending, and I'll hand it back over to Steve.
Yeah, thanks, JT. And I'm sorry we lost your video, but I figure Audible JT is better than no JT, right?
Correct.
And thanks to all the panelists. Thanks, Eric, John, and Abdul, and thanks to Zixi for sponsoring the session. And it was a great conversation. I forget who said this, but I wrote it down. I think you can't optimize what you can't measure. I think that might be the quote of the show.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and also, I want to congratulate Luke Wu, who was the winner of our Amazon gift card. He correctly identified Leslie's March by Solus as the walk-in music. And please join us tomorrow. We've got one more day, and we'll be back at 10 a.m. Eastern Time with our research keynote on live streaming technology trends. So thanks again to everyone, and I hope to see you tomorrow.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.